questions of environmental ethics, what I believe, where those beliefs come from, these are things that I've thought a lot about. And I'd have to say I'm like most people. I think we're all parts of a story. There's a story to everyone's life that helps explain where we come from, why we think the things we do, what's important to us, and probably helps explain our actions. And in my case, I know that I grew up in a family that was to some extent environmentally conscious, took notice of environmental issues around us as I was growing up, and I think that added to my own awareness. One example of that is that I grew up in Columbus, Ohio, and in the 1970s and 80s, the issue of acid rain started to become important, and I think at the time when I was in middle school, it was in the news a lot, and the notion was the way that we get power in Ohio by burning what turned out to be high sulfur coal was creating acid rain in the Adirondacks. And even as a middle schooler, at just the most basic sort of gut level, I thought to myself, so when I turn on the light switch, it's causing, to some extent, it's causing sulfuric acid to fall in lakes and damage ecosystems in another part of the country. That just seemed wrong, and that bothered me. That was disturbing to me. And so that was something that made me want to learn more about ecology. It made me feel like I think I need to do better and I need to understand things better. And that's what led me to want to go to college and study ecology. But I also came from a family that we did a lot of camping, we did a lot of backpacking, we spent a lot of time outdoors. I think I grew up with a love for the natural world and for the beauty of the natural world. Had a great aunt and uncle who lived in Oregon, and I got to go backpacking when I was 6 years old and saw some of the most spectacular scenery in the world. And things like that made me really value the beauty, especially in the United States, where we have such astounding parks and natural landscapes that are awesome and awe-inspiring. I think that instilled in me some kind of a value for these beautiful places that are really just a gift to us. I wanted to sort of take care of those kinds of places. But I also grew up in a family with farming roots. Both my folks grew up as farm kids in northern Iowa. We had a small farm, basically, that I grew up on, a little 4-acre hobby farm. And we spent a lot of time in the garden, a lot of time outdoors, working on projects, building things, in the dirt, going across the road and playing in the stream. There was sort of the creek across the road that I grew up in, where we'd spend half the day on Saturday with the neighbor kids just sloshing around in the stream, and my socks would wad up in the end of my galoshes. And I think all of that interaction in the natural world was a place where I formed a sense of myself. I think that's a place where I gained some leadership qualities. I think that's a place where I gained a sense of sensitivity to others and to the natural world around me. Those experiences were important. But I also think that gardening, as sort of the agricultural heritage of my own family, was important. I know for a while, anyway, for a couple of years, I think we were producing about 75% of our own food in our own garden. We had huge gardens, and we didn't necessarily keep. The older that we got, that became different from my friends. Like nobody else did that so much, and I didn't think it was so cool anymore. It was interesting. But that stuck with me. A lot of time in the garden and seeing things grow and planting things and tending to that garden. I think that was something that was valuable too. So I think my family had a formative experience on me, but that also overlaps with my experiences and sort of my connections to the natural world and to the outdoors, and the lessons that I learned there, I think, were formative for me. In my later years now, I have 2 boys, one who's 6 and one who's 9. And I think being a father has had a profound impact on the way that I view the world and the way that I understand my place in the world. And so I look at the world that we're leaving to our children now, and it really strikes me with a lot more depth. The thought, well, how am I going to leave this world a better place for my kids? How can I make sure that my kids will have the same kind of open spaces and beautiful places and unpolluted places to play, to learn, to grow, to see beauty, to share with their kids? And so I think the sense of passing on a good, healthy world to future generations means a lot more to me now than it ever did when I was younger. And I think the final thing that really describes and has been the place where my values have formed have to do with my faith. I grew up in a home that paid a lot of attention to how should we live based on our Christian faith. And I think a lot of those lessons stuck with me in ways that I maybe don't fully understand. But I know, for instance, my grandfather on my dad's side was a farmer who was sort of a philosopher farmer. And his ethic was, well, really we're just tenants here on the land. And if we can leave it a little bit better than we found it, it'll live on, we hope, for the next generation. That kind of notion was partly just a practical response to trying to be a good farmer and take good care of the land and leave it for your kids. But it also overlaps with a deeper sense of values that came from a faith tradition that was meaningful and provided a context of seeing, and this is a context for me as well, seeing myself as part of something larger than myself. It's not just about me. And I think that mattered. And I can actually say that grandfather died when I was a freshman in college. And it was the first death that I really had to wrestle with. And the first funeral I went to sort of as almost an adult in a way. And one of the impacts that experience had on me was listening to a whole community of people talk about his life and the impact that he'd had on his community. And I sat there as a freshman in college thinking, what are people going to say about me when I die? Will they say these kinds of things, or will they say something different? And what was amazing to me is they said, well, this was the guy who served his community. This is the guy who retired off the farm and went into soil conservation because he wanted to care for the land. This was the guy that spent 5 years trying to build a community center for the town because they didn't have one. He spent years working to create a swimming pool for this small community because they didn't have one. He just kept working on these kinds of projects. They built the first nature center in that region of Iowa because, well, they didn't have one. And so he had this ethic of community service that really appealed to me. And I guess at that time in my life, I was more interested in, and it had more to do with me and how could I get ahead. But this really made me think that when it all came down to it, I sort of hoped that maybe people would say things like that about me, that my life actually had been richer because I had been involved in larger projects, things that had to do with a greater good, things that were good for my community and were good for me too. So those are some of the stories, I think, that tell the story a little bit of where I come from, how my values were shaped. And when I connect that with my observations of, another question is, well, what's going on? What's going on in this world that we live in? And one of the things that I see is, especially in American culture, we're very consumer oriented. We are one of the most consumptive cultures in the world. We have about less than 5% of the world's population, and we create more than 25% of the world's trash. We use up more than 25% of the world's resources. We contribute more than 25% of the world's carbon emissions. And so we're incredibly consumptive as a people. And that's probably not good on the whole. It's probably not even fair. So I think about ways to reduce my impact on the natural world and my consumption, particularly as an American who's probably already using more than my fair share just by virtue of the culture I'm a part of. So that's become something I look at, and I try to do something about that. And the other thing is just simply pollution, whether it's, if you think of carbon pollution and greenhouse emissions, that's one way to think about it. But I also just think about the Olentangy River that runs through campus here. The joke of some of the students in Environment and Natural Resources is they call it the old and dingy because it's, even though we're actually restoring this river right through the middle of campus, we removed the Fifth Avenue Dam and now we're going through this whole great restoration process. The water still never looks that great because it's collecting all this stuff from a whole watershed that has all kinds of runoff from people's lawns and from agriculture. And it's not the cleanest water and probably won't be for some time. And I look at that and I think, gosh, can't we do better than that? So I think sometimes I think people tend to think, well, unless someone can show that our way of living, our lifestyle is going to cause catastrophic global collapse of ecosystems and everybody's going to die because I'm driving my car or consuming resources, I guess I won't change unless it's going to be catastrophic. And I look at the world and I say, wait a second. I like to take my boys fishing, and yet would I let my boys eat the fish that they catch in the Olentangy River right out here, or the Scioto for that matter? And in fact, a lot of them, we have official fish consumption advisories saying you're only allowed to eat so much fish meal per week, otherwise it's going to be bad for you, bad for your health, whether that's PCBs or a lot of that is because of mercury content in the fish. That mercury comes from the coal that we've burned in Ohio because it gets released from the burned coal, it deposits onto the land, it works its way up into the tissues of the fish. And so that same concern that I might have for climate emissions, for carbon emissions, from energy back to my middle school experiences, also is something that's affecting my experience of taking my boys fishing. I don't think that's the way we want it, right? I think we want to be able to do better than that. I think we want to be able to catch fish and eat them out of our rivers. It might even be nice to be able to just drink the water out of our streams, but I don't think I'd do that either. I think we have a long way to go, and we know better. I think we know that we're not doing as well as we need to, and I think we know we can do better. And to me, that's reason enough to change the way I live and to do something in response to those things that I see. So in my life, so the question is, well, what am I going to do about it? And I don't think there's any one prescription of here's what you've got to do about this. But over time, bit by bit, I think I've just been experimenting, and I continue to experiment with what are other ways that I can live, what are choices that I can make that I think will reduce my environmental impact, that might reduce my carbon footprint, and that might also enrich my life at the same time. And so one of those things, quite a while back in the late 1990s, my car died, basically. A cylinder burned out, and I just decided, well, I probably don't need a car. Why don't I just not get a car to replace that? And so I've been a bike commuter ever since 1998. I married back into a car 5 years later when I met my wife, so we have cars, but I try to bike commute as much as possible. But we've also done a number of things in our home. So for the last 5 years, my wife and I have used a carbon footprint calculator. It's just a simple Excel spreadsheet where you punch in the numbers for how many miles you drive in your car, how many miles you flew in the past year in an airplane, how much electricity you used from your electricity bills, and how much heating gas you use, and how much trash you put out at the curb every week. And you punch those numbers in, and it tells you what your carbon footprint is, and it compares you to the US average, and it compares you to what would be the fair level you should be consuming. That's sort of a Kyoto recommended level. If everybody in the world were going to have their fair share, where should you be at? And of course, that number is way below the US average. And so we've calculated that, and we try to do little things to sort of bring our number down, to live, and I think, in a way that would be more just and fair for the level of consumption that I have as an American. And so over time, we've brought that number down with a lot of little simple things. You can change the level of your thermostat, and every degree you bring it down is, I don't know, another 3% better on your carbon footprint, and your utility bill for that matter. We dry a lot of our clothes, line dry our clothes rather than using the dryer. That's a lot of electricity. We bought a more efficient refrigerator because, all the time our refrigerator sounded like a sewing machine going off. It was old and inefficient, right? We've taken the light bulbs in our house, and one real simple thing to do is get rid of the incandescents and get more efficient either CFLs or LEDs. And we've kind of done that over time. So there's a number of things like that we just kind of keep working on that and trying to bring our impact down in ways that are kind of fun to try. I think it's really important to balance what we do as individuals for the sake of our own integrity, for the sake of trying to live out our own values, right? I don't think anybody wants to pollute the earth. I don't think anybody wants to unfairly, consume more than their fair share in a way that takes away from others. We don't tend to see those things. But it's hard to live our values sometimes because our impacts are hidden from us. But we can do the best we can. And there's something empowering about doing what you can as an individual, yet at the same time, collectively, those individual actions can make a difference. I know some people who say, individual actions don't make a difference because really we need to change policy. And to some extent, that's true. I mean, a whole lot of little actions won't add up if we still have sort of structural things in the way that keep us from doing better collectively. But on the other hand, I don't want to be the kind of person who's not living consistently with my own values in the first place. And I actually think that my energy, my passion, my excitement, my clear thinking to actually do something at a larger level, at a policy level or collectively, is going to be helped by living as an individual in a way that is refreshing to me. When I think about the way I live and looking for a sense of participation in something that's larger than myself, that's something of an adventure, that challenges me and pushes me and is kind of exciting at the same time, but also leads to a much fuller and more abundant sense of life, I can't think of anything more important than keeping life flourishing and abundant, contributing to a more sustainable world where we can all flourish. That seems to be a larger task that is endlessly fascinating and endlessly challenging and endlessly rewarding to play a part in. And I think that's part of what motivates me. I think that's somewhat of the vision that I feel that I'm a part of, that keeps me working towards a good life, not just for myself, but for my kids, for other people, and for all of the planet. Yeah, so beyond my own individual actions, part of my own sense of work and what really motivates me is also I'm an educator. I love to teach. And so as a teacher at the university, I feel like I try to share perspective and understanding with students, but I also serve as the board for Ohio Interfaith Power and Light, which is an organization that works with faith communities across Ohio to respond to climate change, particularly through energy efficiency, energy conservation, and renewable energy. And so a lot of the individual behaviors that I've described of trying out at home that my wife and I have experimented with to bring our carbon footprint way down are things that I've then helped share with other families and with congregations across the state. In one program we called Cool Congregations, which was an energy efficiency program here. We actually partnered with the Bird Polar Research Center here at Ohio State to do a little bit of teaching around climate science, but then talk about how do you respond to that. And then I've also worked at the university. One of the projects that's been most exciting to me is what we call Campus as a Living Laboratory, where we take the sustainability challenges of Ohio State and we turn the students loose on trying to come up with solutions, solve problems, and do research into best practices to help answer some of our local questions about, well, how should we restore the Olentangy River? How should Ohio State bring down its greenhouse gas emissions and carbon footprint? How can Ohio State save money by being more energy efficient? How can Ohio State teach around sustainability in a way that empowers students to become global citizens in a positive way? So we've seen a lot of exciting projects where students have actually won grants from the projects that they work on in the classroom to create a bike map for the campus to try to encourage biking, but also to make biking more safe around campus. Had students that actually looked at the river restoration of the Olentangy and decided that, in a few years when the formal monitoring is no longer happening with the river restoration, we're going to be in danger of just seeing honeysuckle take over everything. And so they actually won a grant to create a new course of invasive species management on the Olentangy, where students are learning about that and actually participating in creating the plans to help avoid an invasion of honeysuckle to take over the native plantings and the other restoration efforts that have been going on. Another student group won a grant in partnership with some other student organizations to create a chef's garden for the Heirloom Cafe at the Wexner Center, so that there would be a little bit of local agriculture right here on campus, contributing to the ethos of that cafe, which tries to serve local foods and operate in a sustainable manner. So I get really excited about seeing the challenges of sustainability translate into exciting projects in the classroom that I think bring out the best in students who are working on these problems because they're passionate about the world, they're passionate about sustainability, they're passionate about Ohio State. And they're actually getting a chance to learn by trying to solve some of those problems in the classroom in a way that has real impacts on the community.